there seemed like there were a lot of books out there, a lot of research which was being done, which was saying that we can't really continue with this current growth model. But the question was, well, what do we replace it with? There were a lot of questions, particularly around the time of the financial crisis. And so we were really interested in bringing people together and trying to get them to work on solutions for how we could do this. And about 250 people from all over Europe and the world really attended this conference and contributed to it. And the result that came out of this was a big report that we wrote called Enough is Enough, which had a number of ideas from the conference on how to build a sustainable economy. And this generated quite a bit of attention. The report was downloaded 25,000 times in the first 6 months. It was translated into French and Spanish. Rob Dietz, who is the director of CASSE, the Center for the Advancement of the Steady-State Economy, which is one of the 2 organizations involved in the conference. The other was Economic Justice for All in Leeds. He and I got together and we said, well, maybe we should continue doing something about this. We'd sort of published a report and we were kind of done with that project on something else. But there was clearly a lot of interest in this. And so at that point we decided, okay, we're going to take the ideas in the report, we're going to transform them into a book, we're going to try and fill in some more of the missing pieces and try and make the ideas more accessible, because it was still kind of an academic document at that point. And so in January, earlier this year, we released the book, Enough is Enough, and had a launch here at the university. And one of the things that came out of the release of the book was the foundation of this group, the Enough Waiting Group, which is a collaboration between the Sustainability Research Institute here at the university and CASSE, the Center for the Advancement of the Steady-State Economy. And this group is really driven by a handful of people. Owen Breer here is one of the co-directors of CASSE Yorkshire. There's also Brian Flynn, who couldn't be here tonight. Margot, who's about to walk through that door, is also involved in the organization of Enough Waiting, and as Tim Foxon at the back here. And so we, yeah, bravo! Just giving a bit of a history on these meetings. And so we decided we were going to have these monthly meetings under the sort of the title of Enough Waiting, with the idea being twofold, because there seemed to be sort of 2 groups of people, or people had 2 main interests. The first was to learn more about the idea of a steady-state economy, which many people were interested in, and the second was to try and drive some change towards this idea, to have some action. And so in general, these meetings are divided into kind of a reading, learning, discussion first part, and then a kind of more action-oriented, what can we do to drive this kind of change, second part, and you're welcome to stay for either or both parts. Sometimes people come for one part or the other part. So, a bit of the brief history behind that. Tonight's meeting is quite exciting, really, because this is the first time we've tried this. We have a bunch of speakers tonight. So generally the meetings, the first components have been more arranged around having a reading, which we discuss, or having a film, which we discuss. But tonight we've got 3 speakers. Very fortunate in that we have Mike Davies from the Alliance for Green Socialism, who I guess you will speak first, if that's okay. And then David Midgley from Schumacher North, who's towards the back there. And then Alex Schafran from the School of Geography here at the University of Leeds. So I think without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Mike. Maybe I'll give you a little bit of Mike's background here. He's originally from London. Yes?
There was a suggestion that perhaps we could sit in a circle.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's as I read the biography here, let's rearrange the chairs and make it a bit more social. Mike's originally from London, 30 years at Leeds. He's a maths degree, recently retired computing manager. He's worked in Swaziland, Zimbabwe, Malaysia. He has a great love for his border collie, who is named CASSE, evidently one of the founding members of this organization. He drinks Burgundy and real ale, but not in the same glass. And he has a few children, stroke grandchildren. Politically, he's a trade unionist, currently with Unite. Spent 20 years in the Labour Party until the year 2000, when he was expelled for keeping the rules. He's currently the chair of the Alliance for Green Socialism, which promotes the interlinked ideas of a fairer, non-capitalist society and the preservation of the ecosystems on which we all live. So, I'll turn it over to you, Mike.
Right, so just have people sit down.
We got enough space.
Hi, I'm Mike Davies, thoroughly introduced. I'm not an academic, which is relevant. But I'm not always nasty for academics. So the Alliance for Green Socialism is really built on those two things: preserving the ecosystem that we all depend on to live, and seeking a fairer society, social justice. And as far as we're concerned, those two things are very closely linked together, because we don't think you can solve problems like global warming in capitalism, and we certainly don't think you can get a fairer society in capitalism. Now, I've put out lots of nice bits of paper. The idea of that is you don't have to believe me, you can see what other people have said in the journal or in leaflets. The Alliance for Green Socialism arose from a couple of other organisations, the Green Socialist Network and a group called the Left Alliance. And it included a lot of people who were ex-Labour, like me, and I was literally thrown out for keeping the rules. Ex-Communist Party people, ex-Green Party people, and when I say ex, quite some of those are still in the various other organisations, because we're quite relaxed about that, and a lot of people who weren't in anything. We have a national organisation and groups and affiliates around the country, of which Leeds AGS is one. Now, we've missed the I out of CASSE.
We'll get that fixed.
Right. CASSE and Enough is Enough are less political than the Alliance for Green Socialism and more tightly focused on the question of growth. But I would say that to the AGS, the question of growth is absolutely fundamental. We believe that it is an absolute nonsense to have an economy that is based on endless, unlimited growth. I meant to bring down a lovely graphic that we did about where we would be in 50 years' time if we grew at the recommended 3%. And it's quite horrifying. So the AGS and CASSE come to the same conclusion on growth. The AGS has been going maybe 15 years, and we very much welcome other organisations that are attacking the same target or part of the same target. I would say that CASSE and Enough, as people here, ought necessarily to come to the same conclusion as we do about capitalism. But actually, it doesn't matter if you don't, because working on growth together, or indeed separately, is fine, because growth is such an important matter. Now, we campaign locally, nationally, internationally, with varying degrees of success. So we've never succeeded in keeping a local post office open, but we have succeeded in keeping a local sports centre open. And stopping McDonald's, well, sharing in stopping McDonald's opening on the Scotwell Road Sports Centre. They wanted to have a sports centre here, and immediately in front of it a McDonald's. Our biggest area of campaigning nationally is climate change, and that is incredibly hard, in our experience anyway. We have a range of international links, France and Turkey and Spain and Latin America. And in fact, one of our odder successes was the invasion of Iraq. A couple of weeks before that, we wrote to every United Nations mission suggesting that they take action under Uniting for Peace, which is a procedure where the General Assembly can act if the Security Council doesn't. And the US government had to write to every United Nations mission saying, if you do that, that will be regarded as an act hostile to the United States. So we didn't succeed in stopping the invasion, but it's interesting how much impact you can have if you happen to get it right. Quite often we don't happen to get it right. We stand in elections, local, national, sometimes European. And I would say that if you're serious about political change, then you have to stand in elections. It's a lousy process, it's a rigged process in many ways, but if you don't do that, I think you're saying, well, we'll just sit on the sidelines and discuss and watch. Certainly for a group that describes itself as political. The Leeds group meets monthly. We had a meeting yesterday. We meet the third Tuesday of every month at the TUC Centre on North Street. We had a meeting yesterday on fracking, which was extremely interesting. There's a national committee, as you'd expect, brings together the different groups, and there's an annual conference, which this year is in Leeds, which is good. There are two characteristics of the AGS. One is that it is very, very democratic, both in terms of the kind of society and political structures that we would like to see, and in terms of the way that it works internally. Anyone here ever been in the Labour Party? No one admits it.
Yes, I have.
Oh, well done. Yes, well, the Labour Party has a machine which is dedicated to not being democratic and rigging selections and rigging policy and throwing out people who make a fuss. And we are right at the other end of the spectrum. The other is that we like to have a bit of fun. We're quite social. So we don't just write leaflets, we go out for walks or go on pub crawls, whatever. Dan mentioned at the beginning that we, in a sense, have two areas of interest. One is discussing and learning, and the other is trying to have an effect. And I'm very, very much in the second camp. Not because I think I know everything, but life is too short, really. So I'm concerned with trying to have an impact, trying to change things. You know, I'm sure that the AGS's point of view will be proved correct, but I'd rather it was proved correct before we were one of the last 10 people on the top of a hill watching the waters rise around us. I think, personal view, the key issue there is educating the public. And when I said earlier that campaigning on climate change is hard, I would have said 5 years ago that most people accepted climate change and you could move on in campaigning terms to what you're going to do about it. I don't think that's true. I think most people don't accept it or are only willing to accept it academically, if you'll pardon the phrase, but not actually engage with it. And in terms of growth, that's even more so. I mean, there simply is no debate about the desirability of growth, or even any debate about how much growth there should be. There's simply a universal assumption that growth is what we're after. You simply cannot see any commentary on the economy, political or media or whatever, that does other than assume growth is what we're after. Of course it's what we're after. So that is a really tough one. Now, the Alliance for Green Socialism puts a lot of effort into trying to educate people. I mean, we've produced hundreds of thousands of leaflets, knocked on a lot of doors, run stalls, spoken at meetings, and so on. And I would say, in terms of educating the public, we make a pretty bad job of it. We are remarkably unsuccessful, I think. CASSE, of course, does it far worse than we do, because it's not really even trying to do it. So one of my hopes would be that CASSE would try and do it on its own terms. I'm not suggesting that CASSE becomes a front for the AGS, but I think CASSE's big problem is the same as ours, that people do not understand the fundamentals of what's going on. I mentioned academics earlier. I think both you and the AGS put too much emphasis in campaigning on facts and analysis and argument, and I don't think, in fact, that's what determines people's views. It doesn't determine how they vote or what they do. That's determined on a much more gut level. Tribal loyalties, and their instincts, and what's on the front page of the Daily Mail. So far more people amongst us, I think, are willing to talk about the issues than actually try and change things, even at the fairly soft but difficult end of changing public perception. Finally, a plug. One of the many wonderful coloured leaflets on the chairs is for Eco-Socialism 2013, which is in Manchester on the 5th of October. And that's something we're organising in cooperation with a number of other groups, people like Green Left, who are the kind of left faction within the Green Party, the Wigan Green Socialists, and surprisingly the Parti de Gauche from France, because they have a very large section in England. Not quite sure why, but apparently they have a lot of people here. So do have a look at that and do think about going to it.
Maybe we have a very brief kind of 5 minutes discussion now, or particularly with any specific questions for Mike, and we'll have the next speaker, and we'll have a much bigger discussion, of course, after the three speakers have spoken.
And why green socialism and not just green?
Well, that's dead easy, because many people who are green are not in the slightest socialist. Certainly the Green Party has a stunningly poor record on socialist issues. Look at Brighton Council, for example. And if you look at where green parties have shared in power in Europe, they have been dreadful, Germany in particular. So we are quite sure that you need both elements to describe what we are.
Quick and burning questions before we move on. We will, of course, open things up to a much wider discussion towards the end here.
And a silence implies consent, so.
But it's enough silence.
Or much bigger questions that can't be answered in 5 minutes.
Well, maybe that's the problem. Okay, well, let's move on then to David. So David studied philosophy at Manchester, Oxford, New York. In 1996, he established the Jamyang Buddhist Center in Leeds, where he continues to teach Buddhist philosophy and meditation. In 2003, he founded Sustainable Futures Leeds, which is an independent group working to develop and promote strategies for local sustainable development, including the formation of the Leeds Eco-Village Group and Transition City Leeds Initiative. In 2007, he founded Schumacher North, which is an independent public education organization working to promote a holistic philosophy of society based on the ideas of E.F. Schumacher, who was the author, of course, of Small is Beautiful. With his colleagues in Schumacher North, David is active in working for a new vision of economic life based on non-violent economics, human-scale social organization, and reconnection to the natural world. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Dan. Okay, let's congratulate Mike on keeping so punctiliously to time. I think it's unlikely that I'll do that because there's a lot of stuff bubbling up here. But I've been asked to talk sort of half of my 10 minutes on our experience, on what steady-state economy means to our organisation, and the other half on capacity building. So I'll try to do that. Hard to limit the first one to 5 minutes because really it is the whole underlying idea of Schumacher North. And in fact, we've got an interesting 40th anniversary this year. It's the 40th anniversary of Herman Daly's first book, Setting Up the Principles of the Steady-State Economy. It's also the 40th anniversary of Small is Beautiful, and it's also the 40th anniversary of Limits to Growth. So interesting. All those books came out 40 years ago. Where are we now? So we have to do some real deep thinking. And that, I think, is what Schumacher North is about. It's what E.F. Schumacher was about. He not only pointed out what should have been obvious, that you can't grow the economy forever, although he seems to be the first person to really bring that to public attention, but also to look at what kind of deep changes in the whole sort of basis of society would be needed to make that a reality. So I think that his book and Herman Daly's book, which is an absolutely brilliant technical analysis of how you can have a steady-state economy and what are the fundamental flawed assumptions in economics that create the idea that we have to have perpetual growth. So that's what Schumacher North is about, and so the question why we're interested in a steady state economy, as with Mike, it answers itself. It's really what we're fundamentally all about. But again, as with the AGS, it's a particular approach. So it is, the subtitle of Schumacher's book was Economics as if People Mattered. And human scale economics was what he liked to talk about. And not only economics, but the whole phenomenon of gigantism in society. We have gigantic nations, gigantic corporations, gigantic machines, gigantic everything. Bigger is better is the underlying philosophy that's created the world that we've got now. So what, is that just something that's inevitable and can't be stopped? I think what we're seeing now is that trend towards gigantism and perpetual growth is reaching a breaking point. It simply cannot continue to function. And something else is happening beneath the radar. And that's what I want to talk about in a moment in terms of where we could go towards building capacity for something different. But just to respond to Dan's request to talk about our experience of building capacity and what it might mean, Schumacher North has struggled actually to build capacity for itself. We've had very small kind of core group that has kept the organisation going, but I think that we punch very much above our weight, and one of the reasons we do that, and I think CASSE is adopting the same approach, is that we've always been about partnerships. And the other organisations, there are 9 organisations in the Schumacher Circle, of which we're one, and all of them, I think, have this this approach of it's the connections that matter. It's if we sort of silo down into our particular idea and try to promote that on our own, we get nowhere. But it's by seeing the synergy and seeing the fact that all the different initiatives which are trying to create a sustainable world, although in a sense they might be mutually exclusive, and that if you put one vision fully into practice you couldn't do all of the other things, but somehow they seem to function best trying to cooperate and collaborate with each other. And that was really what gave rise to what started all this for me, was the Sustainable Futures Leeds network. A friend of mine in Herefordshire had responded to the fact that the green organisations in her area were felt incredibly powerless. They were all very, very tiny and they were achieving very little. And all that she did was to create a network that linked them together with a newsletter and bi-monthly meetings, I think. Very soon the county council was listening to them, and she was able to put on 2 national conferences on sustainability, where the local speakers were very much on a par with big national speakers like Jonathan Porritt and Satish Kumar, because of the empowering experience that they had of joining together as a unified body. Unified only in the sense that they spoke with one voice, but not in the sense that anybody was trying to impose any particular line or any particular method of working on the individual organisations. So she was keen to replicate that in other cities, and I volunteered to take on trying to do it in Leeds. Very green in the other sense of the word. I had no experience of what was going on in the green movement in Leeds, but contacted a few key people, and it all looked very promising. Unfortunately, I didn't personally have the capacity to continue it at the time, and it folded after a few meetings. But after 2 years, I decided I could do it and called another meeting. One person came, but out of the 6 or 7 different initiatives that had been proposed by the original group, one of them was to have a series of Schumacher lectures in Leeds on sustainable cities. They were very successful, and they brought in people from all sorts of different constituencies, from CADE, the Built Environment Organisation, from both universities, from the City Council, the City Civic Strategic Partnership, the Grassroots Green Movement, all came together around this idea. We had some brilliant speakers, and I think it's had a permanent impact. That led to the creation of Schumacher North. In 2007, we had a much bigger meeting in Leeds Town Hall on peace, ecology and spirituality, which attracted 400 people, and again, I think that's made a permanent impact. So since then, we've run a number of courses, public lectures, particularly 2008 which is quite well timed actually. In November 2008, we had a series of lectures on transforming the global economy. It was about 2 weeks after Goldman Sachs went down. So Lehman Brothers went down, that's right. So that was interesting. The following year we moved to a conference format, and we had an open space meeting. So we had 200 people representing, and it's something like 40 or 50 different grassroots organisations, and obviously just a lot of individuals as well. Out of that, one of the things that came out of that was the initiative for the 2010 Steady State Economy Conference. So we've been able to catalyse these kind of initiatives. The Leeds Eco-Village project, which is now Lilac, was another one. So it's making the connections, building partnerships. We've been very, very lightweight in terms of our organisation, and we've suffered for it. We haven't been able to get funding. We haven't kind of been able to get together the sort of legal structures and employ anybody. It's been very much sort of flying by the seat of our pants, individuals giving their time and energy. What I just want to finish with an idea that I'm working on at the moment. It's really come to my mind that the local focus of Sustainable Futures Leeds was something that we got right. And I was reluctant to dissolve the organisation, but I just felt I didn't have enough personal capacity to continue it. I now regret that. And I'm working on an idea to revive that in a different form. And I just want to introduce this remarkable book, The Third Industrial Revolution by Jeremy Rifkin. Anybody here know this book? One. Two. Okay. Okay, so what's remarkable about this book is not so much the ideas contained in it, which in a nutshell are that in order to move beyond the fossil fuel economy, which is now at the end of its useful life, and move to a sustainable world based on renewable energy, you need to bring together 5 different elements. So the renewable energy production itself, it also needs to have a different type of electricity grid. It needs to become sort of unified with the communication technology of the internet and a smart energy grid. It needs a storage medium, so the hydrogen economy, we need to have that. It needs changing the way that we create buildings so that they generate their own energy, they become the power plants for the society, and it needs different transport. It needs electric and fuel cell powered cars. All those need to work together in synergy. Well, that's a great idea, but there are lots of great ideas about it. The interesting thing about this idea is it's been adopted at the highest level as the governing economic strategy for the European Union, and they're putting it into practice. Does anybody know that? How many people knew that? Right, one person knows that. I asked our local MP, I asked Andy Goulson, head of the Sustainability Research Institute. He wasn't aware of it. So it's amazing what happens under the radar. But this is actually happening, it's being put into practice. For example, Jeremy Rifkin's organisation has created a 40-year master plan for the city of Rome to transform it into a totally zero carbon sustainable city powered by renewable energy. I thought we could bring this idea to Leeds and we could use it as the sort of linchpin idea for a renewed sort of surge of energy to let's be the most sustainable city in Britain. Let's be the first city to take this workable, practical strategy on board that is now being adopted in a large part of the world. It's really, for me, it's a peg to hang things on, because I totally agree with Mike. It's not just about the technology. It is about transforming the whole sort of nature of economic relationships within the society. I want to just hold up one more book, this amazing book by Charles Eisenstein. Perhaps more of you have heard of that one, Sacred Economics. Okay. This is the biggest challenge to standard thinking in economics since Schumacher and Davies in the 1970s. And it's really the most optimistic book I think I've read for decades, probably. He's talking about practical ways to create an economy that is based on gift rather than greed. Okay. He's coming to Leeds to Well, he's giving a Schumacher lecture in York in November and a day workshop here in Leeds which is actually based on his forthcoming book, which will be called The More Beautiful World Our Hearts Know Is Possible. This is a moment, people often say that Schumacher is about the spiritual side of the Green Movement. Well, I think this man really sums it up more than anybody. But it is very practical stuff too. So I urge you to, if you can make time to come to that 23rd of November, and also to read this book. You can download the book, all of his books, free online on his website, charleseisenstein.net. And they are, I think, they're two of the most brilliant books that have been written in the last several decades. This one and one called The Ascent of Humanity, which is a very, very far-reaching analysis of what's gone on with our whole civilization and how it can be changed. So I'm hoping that you'll hear more about One Planet Leeds very shortly. It's a very, very new idea for me. But what I want to do is to use this idea as a way to bring together, if I can, as many of the different elements within the city that are concerned with creating a sustainable city as I can. The thing about it is that it's an economic win-win as well as everything else. We can, in fact, get the business community converted to this idea, and people on the city council, if they have if they're able to grasp the significance of the idea. So these two books, I think, they've actually have saved me. Because at the end of last year, I'd just given a 10-week course called Eden or Apocalypse: Can We Save the Planet? And my optimism was relatively low after I'd done all the research for that course. I then came in contact with these two books, and I see that you can never write off human creativity. We don't know what's around the corner. I urge you to read one or both of these if you can. They are fantastic, and they have inspired me back to a level of optimism. So I'm hoping that we can work together, especially with CASSE, but with all of the sort of organisations and university departments and the city council and so on, who are concerned with, can we build a sustainable and equally important, or more important, an equitable city? We have an incredibly wealthy city with horrendous poverty. It's a disgrace. Let's do something about it.
Quick question for Davies. Yes.
Yes, you said it's been adopted by the EU. When was this?
Okay. In 2007, in principle, and but the more detailed, concrete plans are being put in place as from 2011. I think. There was a long consultation process. It's very complex. How are we going to do it? But over the last 2 years, major initiatives are starting. There are problems with the austerity situation, and some of the funding has gone west. And they're trying to. Jeremy Rifkin is trying to work with them to figure out ways that they can do. They want 9 billion euros of public funding from the EU to catalyse 200 billion euros of investment to start to create the infrastructure that will be needed for the new renewable energy economy.
Right, okay. So apart from being adopted in 2007, the initiatives are actually going. It's not just adopted and put on the back burner.
No,
it's actually
happening.
It's actually pushing.
Yeah.
So there is a push.
And there is major funding. There are several billion euros have been allocated to creating this new grid, but it will need more. He's fighting a battle at the moment to get the investment that's needed. And the problem with the economy is that the fossil fuel economy is dead. There's no way that it can move forward. So this is where the smart money is.
So what catalyzed this in terms of getting Rifkin's ideas into the EU out of curiosity? Any idea what sort of drove that forward? Because of course there's lots of good ideas out there, but so often these things, they don't get to that sort of level. They're not taken seriously.
Yeah, I've only recently discovered him, so I can't tell you really enough about the history. He's somebody who's been operating at a very high level in the world of sort of big political policy as well as big business for a number of years. He's a very seasoned operator, and he's able to talk to some of the key people. He's for instance been very closely working with Angela Merkel, and Germany is the country that has taken this on board most strongly. Yeah, there's a lot about it in the book, about how he's actually brought it about. It's very interesting to read, probably less interesting to talk about in this forum. But yeah, it is a good question. Why?
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, one more quick question. Yeah.
Have you heard of a guy called Tesla?
Nikola Tesla,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
Yes, I certainly have, yeah.
Alright, so say, because he tries to get funding for free sustainable energy. Was it the early 1900s?
That was about 100 years ago, yeah.
Yeah, but there's still
It's a little bit
groups
ahead of
that
his time.
still trying to now get his work recognised. Because he had a lot of good ideas, but there's no funding, was there, for anything. But I just wondered if you looked into it.
I know that there's a lot of people talking about Tesla's ideas now. It's interesting. I mean, he was a lot of his work was neglected at the time he was running because he's just too brilliant, really. He's an incredibly brilliant man. Also slightly strange. But.
Okay, well, this takes us on to our third speaker, Alex Schafran, from the School of Geography here in Leeds. Planner by training, he holds a master's in urban planning from Hunter College and a Ph.D. in city and regional planning from the University of California at Berkeley. His award-winning writing about planning, cities, and regions has appeared in numerous professional and scholarly journals, and he is a regular contributor to the Polis blog. Prior to pursuing an academic career, he worked for a decade as an organizer, advocate, policy analyst, and planner for a variety of social justice organizations in New York and California. Over to you, Alex.
Yeah, thank you. I should add that I drink Bordeaux and cheap Pilsner. And also not in the same glass. Thank you.
Excuse me, before I start, could you just ask what the Polis blog is, please?
Oh, it's a collaborative blog for written mostly by young urbanists, urban planners, geographers, writers, just about cities from all around the world. It's just if you Google the Polis blog, you'll see a bunch of my writing. There's just little bits and pieces about different aspects of cities and urban policy all around the world. I happen to like it. Some architects, sociologists, activists. It's a real mix. Well, this is wonderful. I really appreciate the invitation from Dan and from Margot. I'm an old organizer, and so I know when I'm being organized, and I love it. And so it's all of a sudden I'm like, how did Dan find out about me? And I know it took me a while to figure it out. This is wonderful for a few reasons. One is that I've had a long time interest in this kind of work, but for various reasons went one direction with my professional and academic career. And kind of have left a lot of the sustainable, just sort of questions of sustainability and green economics behind. And I'm going to explain, some of it has to do with what I'm going to talk about tonight. So I'm really honestly, to tell you the truth, speaking to you as a Northern Californian, and not really as a member of the geography department at the University of Leeds, and certainly not as a resident of Yorkshire, because I've been here for about a month. So I know absolutely nothing, really, when it comes to my new hometown, and I'm excited to be here and to learn things about ideas, about activism, about what's going on. And so I'm not going to speak really in any way about what I imagine your experience is. I'm going to speak around the experience in California around these ideas. And I'm hopefully going to address, I think, a few of these questions that have brought up. One is why socialism and not just the green part. The other is why have we been talking about these ideas for 40 years, but yet it feels like progress hasn't been made. And the other is in some ways this kind of question of working together in coalitions. And in typical academic fashion, I read the book, I know more about the book than I do about the various organizations. So anything I say critical is I'm going to do a kind of academic book review, which is, we're going to say a couple of good things, and then I'm going to say a couple of critical things, and then leave you with a nice zinger. So on the, I was introduced to this stuff by the work of Paul Hawken and Amory Levins in particular, the Rocky Mountain Institute folks in the late 90s. And for me, this book is a real jump forward, in particular because it's way more progressive economically. Y'all talk about ownership, new forms of ownership. You talk about debt in a way that I found really kind of largely missing in a lot of either environmental stuff or even in a lot of environmental economic stuff. I think green energy is important, and energy is important, but that's not the only pathway forward. For instance, we use a lot of energy, and we impact the environment heavily based on how we own things. if there are new methods for owning cars, new methods for owning homes, new methods for a sharing economy, it becomes a lot more environmentally efficient. This is not just about windmills, about new forms of technology, which is really, I would argue, dominated the conversation. So I think the ownership part is really important for a major reason in that regard. And same with the debt question, right? How we finance things, how we pay for things, when we pay for things, I think is really, really critical. And I think that you've made a huge advance in that area. And there's two reasons why this is important. I mean, one is the substantive aspect of that I don't think that we can get to the places we're trying to get in terms of a steady state economy or a more socially just society or a more ecologically sustainable society or any of the visions that I think we collectively share without some of these platforms, substantively. But there also is in terms of the question is politically. Right? So the story that I really want to share in some ways is about why in over 40 years we don't feel like we should have made the progress that they really should have. And the question actually, the answer is about the coalitions that haven't existed. That I think that a lot of environmental organizations or social justice organizations or certain different types of groups have been very good at creating small scale types of coalitions, ways to put on specific campaigns, to put on specific events, to put on specific campaigns, but not enough to push the major institutions to move the United States government or the UK government or the state of California or to move major global corporations or to really bring together broad issues. And there's two reasons for that historically in the state of California. One is that environmentalism, which has a very deep history. You know, this is the home of John Muir, or not the original home. You all created him, but we raised him. We'll take credit for him. You know, this is really the birthplace of the environmental movement. And the environmental movement was really excellent and very successful as a middle-class movement for preservation for a very long time. I mean, there's a reason why the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds is still, I believe, the largest organization, non-governmental organization in the United Kingdom and one of the largest non-governmental organizations in the world. I mean, I think odds are that at least a few of you are members of the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. It's almost required in a room full of people in the United Kingdom. This was a huge part of our history, and we were very, very successful at running that movement sort of as far in some ways as it could go. New environmental legislation, park preservation, landscape preservation, etc. But what happened is that people started to criticize it for two reasons. One is that we still had a major poverty problem, and we continue to have a major poverty problem. And we were sort of unable, as this middle class, we were unable to sort of move increasingly numbers of people out of the poverty and into the middle class, and the environmentalists really had nothing to say about it. So out of this came ideas around sustainability and lots of ideas in environmental economics, but you didn't necessarily have, we haven't really had a whole-scale movement politically. So in California, the majority of mainstream environmental organizations like Sierra Club, like the Audubon Society, still haven't adopted the type of progressive economic platform that is available here. This has prevented any sort of large-scale coalitions. Really, I mean, we're talking about coalitions at the level of the state of California, which has 40 million people, at the level of the United States government, that's able to really sort of move any major legislation, any major platforms politically forward. The other aspect is the question of race and inequality. And so when I told Dan that I was going to read this, and I opened it up and I saw that there was a chapter about population and a chapter about inequality, I was like, you know, Dan, these are the ones I'm going to read critically in particular. And so the environmental movement also has a sort of deep, dark, ugly secret, which is its long-time links to the eugenicist movement starting from the 1920s. A lot of the original thinkers that a lot of the early environmentalists were also influential to the Nazis. It's a really, really, really deep and dark and ugly secret. And the two major sources of this were California and the United Kingdom. So we are sort of deeply, deeply guilty and responsible for a lot of this early eugenicism. The problem I really have with this in some ways is that it still maintains a very classic environmental policy about restricting immigration. Now, I personally believe that there's actually no sort of substantive reason for this because there is no such thing as a steady state economy in Leeds or in the United Kingdom. There's only a global steady state economy or there is no steady state economy. This is particularly true in the United Kingdom. I mean, no country in the world has been so dependent historically on international trade, on globalization. I mean, you essentially invented globalization. Everything that has been built here, for the most part, has been dependent on this very long system. This is the system that we have. There will be no steady state economy in the United Kingdom without a steady state economy globally. So, but the connection to this immigration platform, it's still in here. And because that's still in here, I can't give this book to any of my allies in the social justice movement, in the racial justice movement, in people of color movements, people that now in California represent almost 50% of the population. In the state of California, we have a lot, what I call the Obama coalition. Essentially middle class, environmental thinking, moderate Democrat or moderate Labor Party type of folks, including some that are more progressive and more radical, but still white and middle class, and large communities of color, the vast majority of whom are either immigrants themselves or children or grandchildren of immigrants. We have a relatively low African American population, so the big powers are Latinos, Asians, huge numbers of immigrants. These are the two powers. We have 70% of the voters to elect Obama, but we can't agree at the level of policy in the state of California on moving us forward on energy, on a lot of labor issues, on a lot of where do we build homes, how do we build public transit. We've never been able to sort of form this into a coalition to produce the type of on-the-ground policies that you're talking about in here, in some ways because this disconnect still exists between still a very middle class and very white environmentally centered movement and communities of color, immigrant communities, social and racial justice communities that are focused on more on economic and immigration issues. And again, there are so many good ideas, and I would love nothing more than to be able to sort of give this book to my friends who are interested in environmental economics and say, hey, listen, look at the progressivity that they've made on ownership. Look at the progressivity that they've made on debt. But because that anti-immigrant stance is still in there, I can't even give it to them. And I know from when I mentioned these critiques to Dan said to me that, well, he has mixed feelings about it. He knows that some organizations have endorsed most of the platform, but with the caveat that they don't endorse that part of the platform. And so that might work here in the UK. That won't work in California. You have to either take it out or we're not even going to come sit at the table. Because at this point now the Latino community is like, we're 40%, we're 45%. We've put up with 150 years. I mean, this was Mexico before it was the United States. We've been putting up with this bullshit for 150 years. We're not taking it. And we're not going to come sit at the table and be a participant in this revolution that you want to talk about, which in some ways, if you took that out, we'd be right there with you. So we've never been able to truly take advantage of the 70% that we have. And so we allow the 30% or the 1% to really dictate the policy, and we're continuing 40 years afterwards to kind of go down that same path. And so the piece what I would like to suggest in some ways is a kind of an alteration to your, on page 10 of the book, you suggest that there's a sort of a three-step stage of kind of, I would call it the theory of change, right? One is a widespread, understand the problem. Number two is develop practical policies for achieving this steady state economy. And number three is develop the will to act. And I would argue that the problem is that those last two things are in fact reversed. That you need, or not even the reverse, but they need to be fused. You don't need practical policies. You need practical politics, right? We exist in our groups. We have our groups that we're, like Mike said, we have these groups that we feel part of, right? So at the end of the day, these identity groups, these affinity groups, these groups that we know that we're a piece of, and that we're going to vote in particular ways. We need to move organize these different groups of humans together that we know form the 60% or the 70% or the enough percent of the humans on the planet and in England and in California to move this agenda forward. You need to, the fundamental focus has to be on organizing them. And the policies themselves that sometimes need to be altered to make it so that everybody feels like they're getting a seat at the table, everybody's voice is heard. And that, in my opinion, would require taking out some of the stuff about immigration, which honestly you really don't need. It doesn't push you forward. It doesn't make all it does is make you enemies. It doesn't make you allies. And intellectually, it doesn't make any sense. Now, some of the larger kind of global population stuff, I'm a little bit more sympathetic to. And I think you actually do a much better job of really acknowledging some of the sins of the past. I don't know if it's all that necessary. Again, you ask the question. How many people is it going to bring to the table, and how many people is it going to chase away to the table? And I think in both cases, you're going to chase a lot more people away from the table than you're going to bring to the table. And so that's my message. My other message is that I also agree that Jeremy Rifkin is a very, very interesting man, though I would encourage you to read The End of Work before you read The Third Industrial Revolution. I think it's a a more important idea, and this is because this is his really profound argument that other people make, which is essentially for the first time in human history, we now live in a time of labor surplus. Human history has been, yes, there we go. That's the book that I think is really, that's the book that I think is in some ways the foundation, is that we now have more humans on the planet than we need to do all of the daily tasks. And so our economic problems are in some ways everything we've given socially value, especially, as probably good Protestants you understand, so much of our work ethic, everything is tied to work. We want people to work in order to get stuff. But there's now not enough work, and there's never going to now be enough work on planet Earth in order to put everybody to work. But there's more than enough stuff for people to eat. So that, I think, is my favorite book. I will get off my high horse. Thank you for having me. I'm from California, but I speak like a New Yorker, so it's the rapid fire.
Thank you, Alex. Immediate questions for Alex before we have more general discussion on all these topics? Go ahead.
There's a book just come out entitled Ground Control. Have you heard of it? It's virtually privatising the city.
Okay, wait. The name rings a bell. I have to, it could be David Bowie, but it's. But do you know who wrote it? Do you mind if I look it up? But I don't. But is it advocating for privatizing the city, or is it, talking about the privatization of the city?
That's a guess. In Docklands in here.
Okay. Yes, I do know about it. Yes.
And America as well.
Yes.
Where they're huge shopping malls, and they have supreme control over what happens.
I've been to your new privatized shopping mall in downtown in the city center of Leeds. You gave away the farm. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's been a huge trend, unfortunately, everywhere in the world.
Start with Mike and then
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Just a quick question. You talked about US middle class environmental movements. The Sierra Club in particular, last time I looked, they were, I think, on the brink of adopting a basically racist, anti-immigrant approach. Is that still the case?
That's a good question. And actually, it's been a while. This was an earlier era of research. I mean, the first piece I ever wrote as an intern right after university was about the history of the eugenics and the environmental movement. And it was because that was the first time it had been debated. They had passed in California some sort of anti-immigrant statement. This was there's a big wave of anti-immigrant sentiment in California in 1994. I do believe that they have pulled back from the brink, but don't quote me on it. And the other thing about, this being the US, everything is kind of decentralized, and so, Arizona Sierra Club is not the same as California Sierra Club, which is not the same as National Sierra Club. I mean, so, I don't know. And there's been issues, right? So there has been, to their credit, a bunch of environmental groups who've peeled off to either become more progressive groups, more green. So we don't have anything sort of, because you can't call yourself a socialist in the United States and get anywhere, we don't have anything called that, but I'm sure if you sat down and put your policies next to each other, they'd be like, oh, we agree. There's also, I think, a lot of kind of urban some environmental groups who recognize that, rebuilding inner cities is an important part of reducing urban sprawl. So that if you don't help people in the ghetto, then you're not going to actually save the birds and the trees. So there's been some effort to then build coalitions, but we've never been able to really achieve it at scale, and never really been able to take advantage of what I would argue is a coalition large enough in terms of actual voters to win.
It's interesting you're saying that you can't have, you have to have a global steady state economy. That's the way you have to think about it. That sort of like, begs the question, well, when was the last time there was ever a sustainable economy? My view is that, in Europe, 1400, or not even then, China and India maybe had sustainable economies up to about 1800, and sub-Saharan Africa, 1900 or something like that. Is it worth thinking in terms of what a stable steady state economy could look like for a country with well-defined boundary like Britain, where it doesn't trade. All its trade ends, and it meets all its needs from within itself. Or maybe you can think about that in terms of North America. Not, you know, put a boundary across the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans and just consider the sustainability of that.
I mean, as an intellectual exercise and an economic model, I mean, I never want to sort of advocate that one shouldn't think about certain things. I think something could perhaps be learned from that.
Mm.
But that vision of an England, I would argue, is A, never going to happen, and B, not one that I would advocate for. So when you start talking about that in terms of political terms, I think you get yourself into a lot of trouble. Partly also because as long as I would be okay with it as long as England also stopped trading finance. If the city stopped trading debt, then you just kept the pound sterling where it got, then fine. But I would argue this is just not a vision of the. It's not the globe has become increasingly interdependent. I don't see any way beyond that, and I think that that's fine. I mean, I'm working on a paper with a colleague, Paul Timms, and Antonio Freire in the transportation department. And one of the things that we're looking about is, we have a difficult time, right? In terms of we look back in some ways at older forms of life, and part of us want to return to certain old parts of life, but there's also kind of a no going back. And how do you really balance that? I think that's the change. There's never been a truly steady state economy or a sustainable economy. I don't know if we'll ever achieve it, but for me, the view involves actually increased mobility. I think it's incredibly, very productive, but it just means, reducing the cost of that, people moving in certain ways, but stuff has to move, things have to move. It doesn't mean that my roommate and I have a banana addiction. Maybe we can reduce our banana addiction somewhat, but I, for instance, I would like less stuff to move and more people to move. I'm a huge believer in open borders for humans and less for stuff. You can move humans more sustainably than you can move tons of bananas from the island. So as long as you can move humans, I don't mind growing all the own stuff here as long as I get to go travel the world. And people get to travel and move for jobs and move for education and move for families and move for all of their kinds of stuff. So that's in particular why the immigration stuff is for me. If you were restricting tropical fruit, I'd probably be on board. Or nuclear weapons, or certain things shouldn't move.
Tim, and then Peter, and then you.
Okay, we'll just quick point on that. Dan's Ph.D. was looking at how far on a national level countries were from a steady state economy, and paraphrasing your conclusion that there are some nations that have achieved sustainability and resource use, but at a much higher level than a fair share that could be achieved at a global level. But the point I want to make, and I think we're moving into a broader discussion, was, clearly the theme of all three talks is linking the environmental movement and the social justice movement, and the actor that seems to be missing, for me, or one of the key actors, is the trade unions, who are, to some effect, active in terms of social justice, but are still very much wedded to the economic growth paradigm. So I was wondering, Mike, particularly from your experience and the others, what are the useful ways of engaging with the trade union movement or elements of the trade union movement who might be more sympathetic to this agenda, because it's still a big membership organisation, even though it's much smaller than in the past.
Who else feel that? Right, confessions. I'm an officer of my branch of Unite, which is probably the biggest union, and I'm vice president of Leeds Trades Council, which brings together unions. But I'm not terribly optimistic about the answer to the question. Leeds Trades Council has done some things. 4 or 5 years ago, we held a day conference on the environment, which was quite successful. Leeds Trades Council is supportive of the Million Green Jobs campaign. But I mean, I've been in trade unions all my life, but they are largely defensive organisations, and traditionally they have been just as, can I use the term productivist? Just as bound into, let's grow, let's make more, but give our members a bit more. Just as bound into that approach as you know, a capitalist government. So it's quite a long haul to actually get into a CASSE position, let alone an AGS position.
Yeah, from my experience, certainly a lot of fear of things like reducing working time, which is of course one of the key proposals around having a steady state economy so that work can be, in theory, shared more equitably across the economy. But trade unions, you know, that's sort of anathema in a sense that, well, cutting working hours, that's, you know, inevitably we're talking about cutting jobs here. And so there do seem to be some kind of impasse issues there.
But like in France, for instance, and actually I think one of the reasons why the Parti de Gauche is here is because the economy in France sucks. So, yeah. But I mean, the French unions have a different viewpoint of how much work. You know, they actually are happy to trade, you know, as long as you're not taking a major reduction, partly because in the amount of hours, but they've gone down to a 32-hour work week and they were willing to do so, partly because the social benefits that are given by the state are greater. So they have, I think, a society that has much more emphasis, for instance, on work-life balance. And that's an idea that runs throughout the France. I mean, the only thing that sort of French capitalists and French labor unions can agree on is that nobody really wants to work that hard and everybody wants to work at 5 o'clock apéro. I mean, that's, and I think that's actually a very foundational ethos for a steady state economy. You know, they've got other issues. But I think there are ways, there are also ways, like with the trade, one of the things we try to do in some urban economics with the trades is, with building trades, is to, like, you know, if you fix up this house, it produces jobs. If you build a new house, it also produces jobs. But we're not arguing to sort of eliminate jobs. One is a steady state economy, which is kind of recycling the existing building. The other is just sort of constantly building new buildings into cornfields. Both create jobs. But how, you know, to convince some of the trades is it works, but for some it would involve retraining. And, you know, we have, unfortunately, building trades, if you are advocated building a nuclear power plant in the middle of Central Park in Manhattan, they would come out with hard hats and be in favor of it.
Peter? And then
well, yes, on that, I happen to have worked in France quite recently, would you believe, as an apprentice or stagiaire.
Wow.
I found my horror that the RTT, the Réduction de Temps de Travail, didn't apply to we stagiaires, only to the fully employed people. And they cheated. They didn't actually work fewer hours. They just took more, they collected their RTT. You know, they still worked 8 to 10 hours a day and then collected it for extra day off. But my real point is to emphasize what you said about coalitions. And I did find Mike's response to my question about why not just be green somewhat belligerent, to put it mildly. And it's not because I happen to be a member of the Green Party or even a supporter. Indeed, the party I support happens to be in the present coalition government at the moment, which is a signal for derision. But in fact, we have to, you know, whatever our aims are, we've got not to be tribal about it. And to realise that there are Liberal Democrats, there are Socialists, there are Green Party people who have the same aims. It may even be that a steady state economy is not the solution. It seems to me that what we all want is a society which is sustainable and where we put less emphasis on stuff and more on people. And, you know, to paraphrase Martin Luther King's famous speech, you know, we can look forward to a day when our characters are, you know, we are judged not by how much stuff we've got, but by our characters. That's what we want. And we've got to realise that people have different ideas as to how to get there, and yet at the same time be prepared to work with them.
If I might, the last thing I said in my presentation was that we were co-organising Eco-Socialism 2013 with Green Left of the Green Party. We have no problem at all in working with people. I'm even still sitting next to my favourite member of the Labour Party.
I'm no longer a member of the Labour Party.
All right.
I'm a member of the Green Party.
All right.
So there you go. I've been a member of the Green Labour Party for 7 years.
And I think on this general idea of sustainability, which we can probably all agree is a noble goal, I think one of the things about a steady state economy, which either makes it an appealing idea or potentially a controversial idea, is it does attempt to articulate, well, how can we do this? So sure, we want to achieve a sustainable economy, sure, we want to have less focus on stuff and more on quality of life and more on well-being, but what does that really mean for the economic system? Like, what policies can we keep and what things have to change? And so it's kind of what we've attempted to do in this work, in the work around Enough is Enough and Enough Waiting, is to put some policies forward. You know, maybe some of them work, maybe some of them don't, but at least to be sort of pinning our colors to the mast and trying to get the ideas out there and get people's responses on them. And so particular ideas like the immigration-migration issue, you know, it's a very small part of that book, probably fits on one page. And it's an idea for trying to achieve a national steady-state economy. So of course the goal is we want a global steady-state economy. That's the goal at the end of the day. You know, we want a global agreement on climate change as well. But in order to achieve that, we believe that someone needs to make the first step in that process, and that it should be one of the wealthy countries, because we are the ones who have realized the benefits from growth, and where growth is no longer contributing to people having a higher quality of life. And so we then start to try and define, well, what would that mean in terms of national economic policy? How can we measure whether countries have achieved something close to a steady state economy? And this is my own work, as Tim mentioned, trying to assess 180 countries. How close are each of those countries to a steady state economy? And so we need to make decisions at that point. You know, do we look at CO2 emissions and energy use and resource use and the stock of buildings and whatnot? Do we look at the movement of people and movement of stuff and try and make decisions around those things? And so again, I think most people in the steady state movement would be very open to the idea of opening the borders effectively. This is one of the proposals which has been made by a lot of degrowth people, that yes, we want the restricted movement of capital and restricted movement of goods and the free movement of people at the end of the day. And even the idea of stabilizing population, which is one of the original ideas going back to 1857 in John Stuart Mill writing that a stationary state of people and capital is effectively what we're looking for. It's almost, I wouldn't say the idea has become redundant, but it's become less important as we're effectively stabilizing population already in wealthy countries. You know, the population in Europe is stable. And in many European countries, it's quite stable as well. And so that's not anymore as important an issue as this focus on GDP growth. So it's always controversial when we talk about population and issues around that. But again, I think the majority of the focus in this work now is on the economics and on the financial system and on measures of progress and things like that. So sorry, you had a point or a question.
More a point rather than a question, and anybody open for answers, because in all the talk today it's been fairly wide, but if you talk more about the actual, when it's the people involved in the changes that then are required for any of this to be put forward in a vision for sustainability, how much is anybody going to be willing to give up in the way that they live at the moment, in the way that they can have access to stuff, whether stuff should be a desirable thing or not, but how much needs to be compromised on the way we lead life today, and you know, that I want to go travel somewhere, that I want to go somewhere, does that have to be compromised on in the way, you know, as my personal view, I don't want to go back to farming to be able to get my food. I want to be able to go still to the supermarket and get it essentially in the same way, and be able to have access to the same variety. So how much is that able to be brought into a vision where you still have, you bring in sustainability, but yet very little in a sense on compromise on the individual, on what they would have to do and what needs to be done on an individual level to have that and still benefit the quality of life and the choice of life that you have at the moment? Is that at all possible to reconcile both and to still live in, you know, if I want to go work somewhere that's not exactly where I live, can I do that? That doesn't actually involve onerous on my person, onerous travelling, that there are proper, either public transport links, but otherwise, is it my personal transport? Does that then have to be obviously more efficient, but does that still not contribute to, you're still in a model where people do what they want and the focus is still going to be on the individual?
Quite like to just respond to that. Two things. First of all, obviously emphasised throughout the Enough is Enough book, is that equality is fundamental to this. And we're living in an economic dynamic of increasing inequality, and particularly people who really already have far too much by any kind of reasonable standard are the people that are consuming the great majority. You know, it's a very tiny proportion of people who are actually consuming the excess of what the planet can produce. That's the first thing. So if we don't think that we can change people's perceptions of what they need at all, including people who are vastly over-consuming, then I think that's a cowardly kind of position to take. We have to be willing to challenge people's perceptions of what it's okay for them to have, at least in the case of that small minority who are consuming the majority of the stuff. I mean, it's, you know, it's something like Kevin Anderson, when he came to give a talk here last year, I think, pointed out that it's 1% who are consuming 50% of the material. And even if you look at that 1%, within that 1%, again, it's a 1% of that who are consuming 50% of that. So that's one thing we need to address. You know, there is a significant number of people who are consuming excessively. That's one thing. Second thing is, in terms of the actual capacity of the planet, if we adopted sensible, productive systems which are designed for sustainability rather than designed for maximum growth, it can produce enough for a really very comfortable lifestyle for the foreseeable, the population that is actually, the population thing, there are different ways of projecting future population. And one of the most interesting ones is done by one of the original authors of Limits to Growth, who's brought out a 40-year update of the Limits to Growth report. His projections of population take into account the effect on population growth of all the other aspects of change. It's a holistic model looking at, I don't know, there's over 200 different parameters that he incorporates into it from all different aspects of society and economy. His projections are that we are already at over 90% of the peak population. After mid-century, population will peak at about 500 million more than it is now, and it will then begin to decline. So the world is producing enough now, actually. We're producing more food than the world needs. It's just being consumed by too few people, because a minority of people are consuming far too much meat, which is very inefficiently produced. Industrial farming trashes the soil. Doesn't produce as much food as organic farming, but it's more efficient in terms of, you know, the industrial capitalist economic goals. So the planet can produce enough. We can learn to be a little bit more modest in what we want. Quality of life isn't measured by how much we consume. And I think we do need to set ourselves the ambition of changing people's perceptions and habits about what they consider quality of life to consist of. And part of that is also about, you know, the insane sort of, we're all working like crazy, working more and more hours, when, as you pointed out, one of the main economic problems we have is that we can't create enough work for everybody. So can we share that work out? If people are working fewer hours, they generally tend to consume less resources because they can use their leisure time, for instance, to, you know, grow and prepare their own food, which is a great thing to do. It's a very enjoyable thing to do. More and more people are doing it. And it's very efficient ecologically. So I think we do need to change people's ideas about what constitutes quality of life. But it's not about people having to trade off quality of life for sustainability. If we do it right, we can have very good quality of life for everybody in a sustainable way.
Okay, I think at that point, maybe we take a break, sort of a 10-minute break. We'll come back at about 15 past. There'll be more wine out in the sort of main area, so if you feel like milling about and chatting, and we'll come back at 1:15 for the action part of this meeting, where I will show you the trailer for the movie of Enough is Enough, to lure you back, and we'll also talk more about different ways that we could build hopefully more coalitions and partnerships, and it'll be more of a sort of discussion format and less of a talking format than the first part. So, a break.